So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Moran. I'm a clinical social worker at Eastern Maine Medical Center in Bangor, Maine. I'm part of a small multidisciplinary group of about 8 volunteers from a variety of local organizations who plan and run the annual Maine Child Welfare Conference. Today would have been the day we gathered in Bangor for our 26th conference, but the pandemic has caused us to alter our plans. Unfortunately, as many of you know, we postponed our 2020 conference to 2021, and we're grateful to our faculty, conference faculty, who've agreed to join us next year. Instead of taking a year off from planning, because we know that the need for continuing education remains, we've decided to dip our toes into this world of web-based education. Our goal is to be able to offer multiple other webinars over the course of the next year with a small registration fee. And we've been able to make this initial webinar available for free, thanks to the generous support of the Northern Light Foundation, Katahdin Trust Company, and Bangor Federal Credit Union. Because of the significant response our little program today has gathered, we've got 934 people registered for today's presentation. We appreciate that all of you feel strongly enough about helping children and families to join us today. Because we've far surpassed the capacity our Zoom account allows, we're also recording the webinar and streaming it live on our YouTube channel. So if you hear from friends who've registered and saying that they can't get in, can't log in, please refer them to the email that they should have gotten about 1 hour ago, which includes the link to the YouTube channel. YouTube participants won't be able to engage with the interactive polls that our presenter offers, but you'll be able to ask questions via the chat functions on either Zoom or YouTube, and the moderators will be able to get those to the presenter to the greatest extent possible. At the end of the presentation, we'll post a link to a brief evaluation in the chat boxes on both platforms. Once you complete the brief evaluation, you'll be directed to an electronic certificate of attendance, which you can either save to your computer screen, to your computer, or screenshot to your mobile device. My colleague Derek will come on at the end and remind you of all of these details. The certificate is good for 1.5 contact hours. We also received approval from the Maine Board of Overseers of the Bar for 1.5 continuing legal education credits and 1.5 guardian ad litem credits. And finally, before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take just a brief moment to acknowledge the state of affairs that exists in our community today and our country today, particularly in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. Since our focus is on child welfare issues, I'd like to remind all of our participants today that CNN and Sesame Street are teaming up for a special on CNN Saturday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, titled Coming Together, Standing Up to Racism. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Chris McLaughlin. Chris is an LCSW, licensed clinical social worker, and the Associate Vice President of Community and Pediatric Services at Northern Light Acadia Hospital in Bangor, Maine. Chris is a lifelong resident of Maine and obtained both his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and his MSW from the University of Maine in Orono. Chris has spent the last 20 years providing behavioral health services to youth and families across a variety of clinical settings, including treatment foster care, residential treatment facilities, public schools, private practice, and community-based case management programs. Chris is an adjunct faculty member at both the University of Maine in Orono and Husson University in Bangor, and is the clinical consultant for the Bangor YMCA. He serves on the Maine Board of Social Work Licensure and is a member of both the NASW and the Society for Social Work Leadership in Healthcare, where he's currently the Maine chapter president. He's a graduate of the Disney Institute Leadership Program and the Daniel Hanley Health Leadership Development Program. Locally, Chris was recognized in 2019 for his advocacy work with LGBTQ+ youth and was named Healthcare Social Worker of the Year in 2019 by the Maine Hospital Association and the Maine chapter of the Society for Social Work Leadership in Healthcare. And for that organization, nationally, he was the 2019 recipient of the Eleanor Clark Award for innovative programs in patient care for his work on youth suicide prevention. And just this spring, Chris was also named the University of Maine School of Social Work's Alumni of the Year. Having worked with Chris for, I think, most of those 20 years in one capacity or another, I can sum all that up very briefly and tell you that he's one heck of a swell guy. And so with that, I will turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that intro. And I want to thank the committee for allowing me to be the guinea pig for this first virtual forum. I think it's an exciting time for all of us as we broaden our approach to education and outreach and connectedness. So I want to get started. We have a very full hour and a half for you all coming up. And so I'm going to move it over to share my screen. And at this point, you should be seeing a cover slide. If you're not with the planning committee, please let me know. I want to just quickly review the goals that we had established for this presentation. We're going to start by talking about stress and anxiety and what that looks like for kids, but also what that looks like for parents and caregivers and providers. This is going to be a common theme over the next hour and a half of talking about shared experiences and parallel processes that by supporting kids and families, we're also learning skills that we absolutely need to apply to ourselves. We're going to talk about some different frameworks associated with grief, loss, and mourning. And I'm going to introduce some of these frameworks specific to how they may relate to this pandemic. And we're going to end today talking about self-care, both skills for youth, skills for family, skills for team, however you define team, as well as skills for providers. And so I want to jump right into a quick video. This is one of our Acadia Cares videos. This one is featuring several of our providers, past and present, talking about anxiety and what anxiety looks like in kids specifically. And then after that, I want to launch very quickly into what does anxiety look like in the pandemic. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues on the planning committee and for the video on anxiety in youth.
Anxiety is one of those things that it's more prevalent than we think it is, and it's just about people coming out and talking about it.
Anxiety normally occurs in everyone. In fact, a certain amount of anxiety is actually good. If you have a little bit of anxiety before an exam, that sort of stimulates you to do that much better. However, it becomes a problem when the anxiety reaches such a level that it interferes with the person's normal ability to function.
Everyone is looking at me.
Anxiety is typically defined as a threat that an individual perceives. And that threat can be anything from going to school and dealing with peers, to breaking up with a girlfriend or boyfriend, to just being anxious about the amount of pressure that is on somebody.
I can't breathe.
Oftentimes, anxiety occurs because of what they call exogenous causes, like if a child's been berated all the time, told by parents, told by kids, you're no good, you're no good. They internalize that, they can develop that anxiety disorder. But it can also develop in the complete absence of any external stress.
Especially in kids, I feel, they have a hard time expressing, like, I'm feeling anxious about this. And so instead you might see behaviors.
I've got to get out of here.
It might be belly aches, not wanting to go to birthday parties or go to school. Older kids, it would maybe be isolating themselves, difficulty engaging in sports, activities, things like that.
In boys, we see a lot of aggressive behavior. I'm tough, I'm not weak, I can't give up. That whole stereotype that our culture plays into is really reinforced in the presentation for a boy. Those behaviors usually lead to really unfortunate circumstances or consequences, and that can even be suicide.
When it starts interfering with your life and you're not doing things that you were before, that's a red flag of, I probably should get some help.
One of the best resources we've found really is counseling. Where the child can really sit down and explore their inner world with a therapist. And one of the most common methods of treatment in that is called cognitive behavior therapy, where the therapist listens to what the child has to say and then points out some of the incongruities.
And we also use bits of exposure therapy, putting kids in situations that trigger their anxiety, because the best way to deal with your anxiety is to sit with it.
Teach them different skills. Do I need to walk away? Do I need to do some deep breathing? What skills do I apply to this to return to a calm state?
You may see the problems that they have are everyday teenage problems, but they're not. For a teenager, those are life-changing issues. The biggest thing I would say a parent can do for their child is just listen.
Anxiety doesn't go away. It's one of those things that you learn how to deal with. You learn how to manage it. You learn how to reduce it.
You can be doing these things that you were afraid to do. You can go out, you can live your life, you can join the soccer team, you can get on the drama club, you can do those things. And so anxiety stands in the way, but it's not there forever.
So I will make sure that in addition to the presentation slides, that the link to this video also gets out to folks, because as well as the other videos in the series. It's a series that I hope folks can keep coming back to. There's a lot of information there across many different factors of youth wellness. But I want to move very quickly now into what are the reactions that we're seeing with kids specific to COVID-19 and this current pandemic. And what we know is that kids who were struggling with anxiety prior to the pandemic are struggling that much more during the pandemic. And that family members who were struggling with anxiety are struggling that much more. This pandemic has certainly not lessened the impacts of anxiety on folks functioning. And so for adolescents, we are seeing increased stress, frustration, anger, worry, feelings of just being completely overwhelmed. They're restless, having a real hard time settling down. Parents are saying that kids are just pacing and like wearing paths and holes in the rug. They're just making circles, feeling helpless, hopeless, and verbalizing those feelings. Teary, sad, loss of interest, loss of energy. You're going to hear me talk about energy a lot in the next hour or so. And so adolescents are actually able to really identify that they're just drained. They just don't feel the motivation to keep moving. Fingernail chewing, hair tugging, other kind of physical symptoms. And one of the more prevalent features right now is we have adolescents that are absolutely terrified of leaving the home and going into public spaces. We are working with families who cannot get their teens or even younger children out of the house and into the car to do very common everyday things like go to the grocery store or now go get a haircut or those kind of activities. But kids are terrified. They're constantly thinking about this pandemic. They cannot move on. Their brain just continues to play what if scenarios over and over. And they're verbalizing some of those things. What happens if you get sick? What happens if I get sick? What happens if we never go back to school? What happens if I never see so-and-so again? And then those physical fatigue symptoms, butterflies in the stomach, heart rate is up, breathing is up, clenched jaw is there. I've talked with a family member who couldn't get their kid to eat dinner because their jaw was so sore at the end of the evening from being clenched all day long, and they didn't even know it. And then in younger children, rapidly changing moods, kids that are going from extreme sadness to then giggling and laughter, and then back to anger and low frustration tolerances happening several times throughout the day. Difficulty with sleep, and by that I mean nightmares and some regression behaviors, not wanting to sleep alone, but also the baby talk and bedwetting, thumb sucking, needing a light on. Kids that had really mastered some of these skills are now going back to those things. Just really communicating in the best way they have that they need external security and comfort. And with that, chewing and sucking on blankets or other clothing, Kids with exaggerated panic responses. So they're watching TV in the living room and you come up to say, hey, bud, how you doing? And they just jump out of their skin. Their startle reflex is so strong. Their baseline of anxiety is just through the roof. And these are kids who are struggling with parents leaving the home, whether that's for work or whether that's to do household chores or get some errands done. And they're playing some of those what if scenarios out that I just mentioned with the adolescents of, well, mommy, what happens if you don't come home? What happens if daddy never comes home again? Changes in appetite is another indicator. Kids are either eating more than they had been or less. Same with motor activity, either more hyperactive or their actions are a little bit more stifled. And then some of those physical symptoms as well, skin picking, hair tugging, chewing on the nails, kids that are just really ravishing their bodies without even knowing it, without even being in control. And so, as family members and as folks who are supporting families, what can you do? Um, Validate and normalize is number one for a reason. We've absolutely got to have kids know that this is the appropriate response to a scary situation, to the unknown. This is an absolutely appropriate way of processing in kid brains what's happening for them. And so families need to find opportunities to check in often. And I also want to introduce some ideas about nonverbal check-ins, writing notes to one another, leaving messages, leave signage on the door, those feeling charts where kids can slide the magnet or the border around what feeling matches for what they're going through that day. And maybe it's even color coding their clothing. So if Johnny comes in and they start the day in their blue sweatshirt, it's an okay day. But if Johnny puts his red sweatshirt in, that's his way of letting you know he needs something more from you. Keeping daily routines and a predictable schedule is essential right now. Kids need to grab onto any consistency and any ability to plan for what's ahead. I would highly suggest including kids in meal planning. And it's not necessarily about what do you want for dinner, but what's the family going to have for dinner this week? And giving them some control and power over setting the schedule. And then as a caregiver, keeping it, following through with it. Be mindful of screen time. And I know that that is easier said than done right now when so much from education to services to social time is happening on screens. And so by that, I mean, be mindful of the unstructured screen time. And this may be a time to help kids set some limits on social media and allow you to be the bad guy, to say no so they can save face with friends who are trying to get Zoom hangouts and other chat rooms moving. It's a lot. It's a lot for us, and we're going to talk more about some of the consequences of that on us as well as kids. And as parents and caregivers, to know when it's time to reach out for more help, to know when this is above and beyond what some of these other strategies can do for you. For kids, strategies that we want to absolutely encourage kids to do, make time for themselves. Self-care for kids is an important concept, and we're going to talk more about that later. Staying connected with loved ones, and a key word here, trusted friends, encouraging kids to spend time with those people that make them feel good about themselves. Kids need to laugh and find opportunities to laugh, and that may mean rewatching their favorite comedies or funny movies, but finding a way to laugh, not just for kids, but to laugh as a family. In the work that we do with kids struggling with anxiety, we want to teach them some self-talk strategies. So saying these things to themselves and reminding themselves that they're okay, and practicing thinking about, okay, what's the worst that can happen right now, and staying grounded in reality, identifying who they can talk to, and again, validating for themselves that, you know what, it's okay that I'm feeling this right now. We talk to kids about limiting caffeine, being mindful of their soda, coffee, and energy drink intake, that knowing that for some kids, caffeine can increase their anxiety and increase their body's sensitivity to these external forces. helping kids identify what their trigger was, how to distract themselves with good books, music, or TV shows, and finding a way to engage in physical activity. And by that, I don't mean that kids need to get their sneakers on and start running laps around the neighborhood. For some kids, physical activity may be playing with the dogs in the yard. It may be helping with some minor yard work. It may be taking some laps around the house, or if they're out in public, parking a little bit further away, but finding whatever it is that's meaningful for that kiddo to engage in physical activity. So we have our first poll question. It's going to appear on your screen. So according to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, what percentage of youth with a diagnosable anxiety disorder were not getting treatment for their illness prior to COVID-19? So if folks want to just click what your best guess is here. This is prior to COVID-19. And then we'll pull up the responses and take a look at what folks think. So the majority of folks think that it's 60%. It's actually 80%. In this particular research, 80% of kids who meet criteria for a diagnosed anxiety disorder were not getting treatment prior to COVID-19. And I keep highlighting the prior to COVID-19 piece because we know that this pandemic is causing an increase in these challenges. And so if before coming into this, 80% were not getting treatment, it puts that burden and that pressure on us as providers and families and caregivers to absolutely get kids the essential services they need to be able to move on and treat their underlying conditions. So now I want to move to this concept of pandemic parenting. And I love this graphic where it's a parent, a caregiver, they're on a tightrope, they're on an unbalanced surface, and they're on a unicycle, even more unsteady. And here they are juggling every single task and then some that they're being asked to do. And there's clouds in the distance, right? It's this idea that something's coming, clouds are forming, coming over our heads. So we're already unbalanced, we're already overwhelmed, and we don't know what's coming ahead. And I also want to introduce this concept of a marathon for you all. And I know I have a lot of familiar faces in the audience today. And for those that know me, you know that you'll never see me in this kind of image. I'm not put on my sneakers and run around the neighborhood kind of person. But I would call myself a professional marathon spectator. I've done my fair share of supporting friends and loved ones through their marathon experience. And what I know is that when marathons start, I've never seen a marathoner come out of that gate at full speed. I've never seen somebody when the fireworks fly and the gun goes off, I've never seen someone push other people out of the way and zip it. In fact, I see people kind of shuffling feet, finding a lane, finding their pack that they're going to run with, and taking really the first couple miles of the course to adjust to a rhythm. And so I'm going to use this metaphor as we talk about the next several concepts. Because the cliche, as true as it is, though, is that we're all running this marathon, whether we like it or not. And it's this pandemic COVID-19 marathon that we've all been forced into, right? None of us signed up for this. But we're all running it together. We're all at different paces. We're all at different places. But energy and reserves, the gas tank, those are the concepts I want you to hang on to as we talk about the next couple slides. What's this pandemic doing to your energy reserves? And it's this idea of what I call pandemic parenting. that there's no concrete start or stop time. Families are always feeling on duty and being pulled in multiple directions, competing priorities. So thinking about that image of the person juggling on the unicycle, and the refereeing siblings. And I've talked to so many family members the last couple months that are just preoccupied with keeping siblings separated, keeping spouses and kids separated. Folks that are all working in the same space that would never choose to do it this way for lots of good reasons are now finding that some of the dynamics are not really conducive to learning and professional work environments. And families are feeling stuck between fight and flight all the time. And what we know about folks that experience abuse or neglect or are at heightened stages of stimulation from external trauma coming at them, we know that the impact that that has on the body is significant, and the impact it has on their functioning is significant. And I would argue that this pandemic has really forced folks in that in-between space between fight and flight all the time, not knowing what's coming next, and just managing multiple family priorities. And then thinking about the space that folks are working within, that not all of us have the ability to set up a nice home office and a separate space in the house, and not all of us have places where kids know to stay out of it and the dogs never put their noses in. And in fact, I'm working with more and more folks who are in dining room tables and love seats and couches, who are in the middle of their family living their family life. And with that comes this idea that we are over the top trying to keep a sense of professionalism in what is really a chaotic environment. And we're so consumed, whether we are aware of it or not, of, oh my gosh, is everyone on this video seeing my dirty dishes? Can they see the dog hair on the floor? Do they know that I'm wearing the same sweatpants for the last 4 weeks now? Are they noticing that my kids' toys are everywhere? And what are they saying about me? And all of that stuff that happens in a split second is sapping energy reserves, whether we know it or not. And as families and caregivers and parents, any break that we have in our day-to-day duty usually consists of more parental duties. So if I have a half hour in between meetings, I may be running dishes through the dishwasher or doing a quick vacuum or picking up kid toys. It's this idea again that I'm always on and I'm always focused on meeting the emotional needs of others, trying to make sure that my kids' education needs are met, their treatment needs are met, and I'm still checking my email and trying to stay focused on my work environment. And so what happens when we're living in this world of pandemic parenting and we're all trying to just portray this sense of mastery? Well, we've got feelings of guilt and failure, that every aspect of my life is lacking right now. I'm failing at the pandemic. I don't have my kids under control. They're not getting the schooling they need. I'm behind in my emails, and I'm seeing person after person on Facebook who's posting about they just learned sign language and they're teaching their kids how to read Latin, and they've mastered the 5-course dinner, and they've planned hikes of Katahdin and Mount Washington. And it's this idea that everyone else around me is making the most of this time, and I can't get out of these sweatpants. I just feel like a complete failure. And also with that is, again, I'm prioritizing other people's needs. So my work is backlogged. I'm behind in email. I'm behind in work meetings. I'm the one constantly showing up late to our Zoom staff meetings, and I'm feeling more and more overwhelmed. So my focus is all over the place. And I'm exhausted. Zoom fatigue is real. I am here to tell you, and I think I'm probably preaching to the choir out there, that a full day of televideo meetings compared to what a full day in the office felt like is apples and oranges. And I could talk all afternoon about what we're learning about Zoom fatigue and what we're learning about how we as professionals being on camera, what that has done to us. And if we were all together in person, my ability as a presenter to scan the audience and connect with people individually or as large groups, even a group this size, that nonverbal feedback that you all give when you're in conference attending mode, for me as a presenter, we thrive on that. I get none of that here. I'm seeing just myself and my slides. So I have no idea if folks are taking a nap or checked out, or maybe they're not even there right now. And all of those things play through my mind. And then we have this other idea of moral fatigue, where routine actions that we made without a moment's hesitation are now requiring complex thinking. And all of that thinking takes more energy. And so an example I think of, even real life here in my house, with going to the grocery store. 2+ months ago, if we needed milk or eggs or bread, one of us would run in the car and get to the grocery store, pick it up, and be home without a moment's notice, not even thinking about it. Now it's, geez, do I have a clean mask in my car? What if I'm not masked? What if other people aren't masked? Who am I going to see? Are they going to judge me? What if I get sick? What if I make somebody else sick? And it just spirals to these seemingly no-win situations. And what happens? Well, whether or not we actually make it to the grocery store, the amount of time we spent thinking about it and worrying and spending that anxious energy is all thinking that marathon again. It's all sapping that energy. It's all tapping into our reserves. And it means more decreased productivity. It means anger and resentment that other people are doing this better than me. And all of those things bring us right back to the beginning of feeling more guilt. And so what I want to emphasize, and this is the part where I imagine if we were all together, there'd be some head nodding, right? I want to recognize that all of us are right where we're supposed to be, that nobody has run this particular marathon course before. We don't know what miles 6, 10, 14 are going to look like. We have no idea if we're going to go uphill or around a sharp corner, or whether there'll be some downhills that will allow us to coast. We're all doing this together for the very first time, some with more training than others. But this idea that we're in this race that's really divided up into stages. And this has really allowed me and helped me really think through, what do I need to do to better prepare myself? And so back when this pandemic hit, and it hit hard, things were very sudden. Schools were open one day, closed the next. Businesses were on site one day, everyone working from home, literally the next day. So that idea that in that first and the early stages of this pandemic, we were pretty focused on security. We were making sure that basic needs were met. My nest was taken care of, food, family, friends, maybe thinking about fitness, not for me, but maybe for others. And when I put it in that lens, it's really clear to me. It's easy for me to think about why there was not toilet paper for a 30-mile radius, why bread and cans of tomato soup and some of these essential products were absolutely gone. People just were in that mode of, I've got to protect my family. And so there was a run on those items. For some reason, we as a society think when crisis hits, stock up on toilet paper. When crisis hits, get all the bread. And for some reason, when crisis hits, get the tomato soup, those kind of things that we couldn't find for weeks. But also it's important in this first stage of security to recognize and remind yourself that this isn't about failing. You've got to let go of all the ideas and preconceived notions of what we should be doing. I'm the first person that rolls eyes when somebody says, oh, this time has been a gift and we've got to make the most of this time. And now is the perfect opportunity to paint my entire house or plant this gigantic garden. And I am here to say that in stage one, it's really about prioritizing physical and psychological security, not taking on the idea that we're supposed to be uber productive right now. Because then is stage two. This is where our shift mentally starts to happen. That once security has been achieved, once we've met those goals, we can now start thinking about other tasks. And perhaps some of those other tasks are really more professional based. This might be where some of that personal goal setting comes in. Maybe I do want to rewatch this entire show. Maybe I want to tackle that pile of books or magazines that I haven't been able to get to. But it's important not to give into the pressure to make really major life decisions. Stage two, as we're prepping ourselves on this course, isn't the time to start thinking about the most loftiest goals. Because then what's ahead, and I would argue that we probably don't even know when stage three is happening, but it's this idea of the new normal. And I know that's also a very cliched saying right now, but it really is about when things are starting to feel more natural, where new routines are being built. And so even now, the way going to the grocery store felt in April and even May is very different than how the grocery store feels now, right? We expect a line outside, perhaps. We expect folks to be in masks, or if they're not in masks, perhaps they're doing other things. But we've also come to expect that not everyone's doing it the same way. We know there's going to be stickers on the floor, or maybe there's some places where there's shopping carts or cones, but we expect there to be some structure to what being in the pandemic world looks like. And on June 1st, as restaurants started to open, all of us are starting to experience that new normal for the first time as well. And that was going to continue throughout the summer. So that's why I say I'm not even sure that we're here at stage three yet. And that this is, again, the reminder that we are in a marathon here, long term, long distance running. So what I also want to suggest to you all is that all of this stuff that we've just been talking about, all of this, these ideas of guilt and anxiety and worry and shame, perhaps that in addition to those feelings, what it is that we're also experiencing as a culture, as a group, is really grief and loss. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model of grief and loss, which for many of you is maybe a refresher, it was for me. But as I've spent more time with this model and I've spent more time thinking through this model, I have really appreciated the overlay that this has brought me as I think about this pandemic. And so just as a quick reminder, here are those stages of grief and loss, keeping in mind that this is not always a linear process. These aren't check boxes that we say, okay, I'm over this one, I'm into this one now. And for many of us, it's this roller coaster of going back and forth and up and down. And there's no real established time period for these either. But when I think about what are the functions of these stages, that's the important piece for me as I think about the pandemic, is that in early March and maybe through the bulk of the spring, this idea of denial was really, really prevalent. And one of the things that social media has allowed me to do is really plot out these 5 stages based on the posts and the things that I'm seeing on platforms like Facebook, where at first it was this, no, this, the flu kills more people than this thing does, and no, this is all about the high speed phone lines, or this is a total Chinese thing, and on and on and on. But all of that really just kind of is in that denial bucket. And what does that do for us? Well, it allows us time to start adjusting to the loss that we're starting to feel. And it helps us move into anger. And anger gives us a structure that's temporary for most, to allow us to feel something, as opposed to this idea that we are out there lost at sea. We're in an ocean of despair. That's a tough place to be, especially early on in the grief process. And so anger allows us a very well-known approach to deal with what we're dealing with. And I would argue that in our society, we do really well with anger, we don't do really well with some of these other emotions that are associated with loss. It's much easier to be angry and point fingers and then do some of this bargaining stuff of what if and if only. What if this country had done this? What if my leader had done that? What if the president? If only our governor? And you see these things starting to play out on Facebook, and they've been playing out for some time now. That for me is bargaining. Because then what's after that is the depression. And again, I emphasize that depression is the absolutely appropriate response to grief, to experiencing a loss. Depression is what we would expect to feel, as difficult as it is to feel it. And then the final stage in Kubler-Ross's model is acceptance. And by this, I don't mean that we sit back and say that we're okay with the loss, like, oh, well, it happened. Oh, well, that person used to live here. Now they don't. Acceptance really means that we've accepted the reality of what is around us, what's happened. And most importantly, we then have learned to reorganize the roles, our role, and see how we fit in the world after this loss. But then I take it one step further and I think about, okay, well, grief and loss is a real internal, individualized, personal process. Everyone experiences grief and loss in some subtly different ways. And some of it is connected to how we've experienced loss in the past, whether we have a framework of how we process our own loss. But mourning is the external way that we show grief and loss. Mourning is what other folks can see as we're going through our internal grieving process. And so another model comes to mind for me, and it's J.W. Warden's model around the tasks of mourning. What are the functions of mourning? Why is mourning essential to this process of healing? Well, mourning allows us to accept reality of the loss. It allows us to work through the pain of this grief that we feel. It allows us to adjust to the life without the deceased around us and maintain a connection to the deceased while we're moving on with our own life. And again, a reminder that the deceased here is the loss of normalcy, consistency, predictability, social connectedness, and the loss of what we expected things to be like, what the spring would have brought for us. And I think about everything from graduation ceremonies to athletics, to vacations, to concerts, to family reunions, on and on and on. And one function that one feature that this pandemic has brought that all of us can relate to is that every week, something that we may have been looking forward to or expecting to happen was taken off the table. We were told, no, sorry, this is not happening anymore. And I know the folks at the Child Welfare Conference Planning Committee had to deal with this, had to quickly adapt and shift to, okay, we can't do an in-person conference. We've got to do something different. But through that process, there was a grief and loss process that had to happen, that this was the only way we've done it before. And I know I've experienced that myself. And so as a society, but also I would say as a human race, there are ways that we mourn that are very visible and very essential to the process of healing. And so again, here's another model of rituals and the importance of rituals to help us process loss. And you can put rituals in all of these different baskets. There's rituals of continuity, of affirmation, of transition, of intensification, and really across every culture on this planet, the way that folks mourn, the way that societies mourn can be classified in a couple different ways. But the ritual that I really want to make sure that we're talking about and really dedicating time and some of our energy to is this idea that we have rituals to commemorate. And rituals to commemorate are those smaller, everyday things that we do that allow us to pay tribute or remember or think about the loss. And so it's lighting a candle, it's watching videos or going through pictures, it's traveling to shared places, visiting burial sites, planting flowers, leaving balloons. And I see this on the highway, sadly, every time I travel, is you see those spots on the highway where there's a balloon or a stuffed animal or a potted flower to commemorate the loss, the place where loss happened. And so then I think, okay, well, we know that grief and loss is an absolute appropriate response to this pandemic. And we know that it is essential for us to mourn in order to process that loss. And if rituals are the best way that we have to mourn, to gather together or individually process that loss, how can we support clients, families, loved ones, and again, just as important, ourselves, to develop and participate in rituals to commemorate COVID-19? What would it look like and how would this feel if we committed to ourselves and each other that we were going to model appropriate, healthy responses to grief and loss by developing a ritual or rituals that would commemorate this moment, this moment of history, and acknowledge the loss and acknowledge how this loss has impacted us. And I've done this presentation now a handful of times with other groups, and I've gathered some really great suggestions that and at the end, when there's ability for us to interact more in person, I'd love to hear some additional, but I just want to throw out some of the suggestions that have really resonated with me as I've done this presentation with groups of families and educators and staff. This idea that, well, we can create a pandemic playlist. We can put together the soundtrack of the spring, of the songs that either were meaningful for us during this time or remind us of this time, songs, music that we've drawn strength from, either as an individual or as a family or as a team. That I could do a time capsule, the COVID time capsule, where I take a shoebox or a plastic bag and I stuff it full of things that remind me of this time. And I hide it away in the closet, or I literally plant it in the garden, and I come back to it next year or in 3 years or in 5 years. And we look at it as a team or as a family and think about what this moment in time brought us. There's the idea of the bonfire ceremony. And I know many of us have done this in one way or the other, where we just get the big burn pile going and we toss stuff in that we really want to let go of. And so what do we associate with this pandemic and COVID-19? And maybe it's those concert tickets that are no longer valid, or the Broadway show passes that are no longer happening. Or maybe it's a used mask that we had to wear, but we're going to toss it in. We're going to commemorate this moment. Or I'm going to plant a garden or a tree or a bush that would really symbolize what we as a family or as a team have gone through. Scrapbooking and journaling are also suggestions that people have thrown out about ways that, again, as individuals, as families, and as groups of people who are connected to each other, things that we can do together. And so I really want to emphasize that this is essential. This is a task that belongs on all of our to-do lists as we think about, I've got to clean the yard, I've got to get the garden planted, I've got to paint this thing. I want everyone to write in big letters at the top of their to-do list, mourn. We've got to give ourselves permission. We've got to embrace this idea that it is okay to be in the moment of grief and loss, that it is okay for us to make time to mourn. And as I mentioned earlier, it is essential for us to model to kids, to other families, to coworkers, to our own selves, to model that this is the appropriate response for managing the loss that this pandemic has brought to us. And so I want to punctuate this with our second poll question. So this again is a recent study that was done prior to the pandemic, but what percentage of Americans would you say have experienced the loss of someone close to them within the last 3 years? So what percentage of us have experienced the loss of a loved one within the last 3 years leading up to this pandemic. So we'll get some responses. So the vast majority of folks, almost half, say 78%. The second popular answer is 57%, and that's the answer to this question. So over half, 57% of Americans have experienced the death of a loved one prior to coming into COVID-19. And why that is such an important point is before all of this happened, walking around in the world we lived in, more than half of the people around us are probably in some form of grief and loss. They're probably in some way of mourning. As we enter into this pandemic, where it's been loss after loss after loss after loss, we start getting into complex grief situations, and we start thinking about why it makes so much sense that baseline anxiety, baseline depression, rates of suicide are starting to increase. Those of us that work in behavioral health have absolutely known this for the last 2+ months, that our marathon may be a little bit longer than what other folks are running, because the wave of need around behavioral health treatment has not even begun to crest yet. And so some of us are preparing ourselves for a little bit longer of a race. So I want to move into the topic of resiliency. I think it's also essential for us to think about how we can prepare ourselves, how we can prepare kids, prepare our communities, but how can we stay focused on resiliency? And so I want to play our final short video of the CARE series, which is on resiliency, to just get us some level setting of what we mean when I say resiliency. So with that, this is the CARES video on childhood resiliency.
We talk about all of the problems and all of the negativity associated with the problems, when in reality there's so much good going on, and resiliency is such a strong characteristic that everyone has the capacity to experience. As a community, if we all understand that at some point we are going to need some support and need some help and need some hope, by having that understanding, we're going to build a resilient community all around.
Being a resilient person doesn't mean looking through rose-colored glasses at life. Resiliency is that ability to adapt and overcome when difficult situations occur.
Resiliency is so self-defined. It's embracing little successes and then taking those small successes and making them your own and saying, okay, I did this today. This was a good day. And then building upon those.
Everybody has a measure of resiliency. Everybody has some. So how do we encourage that? And how do we help that to grow? The younger that we can do that with children, the better, because those skills just build as they get older.
Some people are born with more natural resiliency than others, but it's certainly a skill that, just like other things, that can be learned and needs to be practiced. And the best time to practice these skills are when things are going well. When the dark days really come, you're going to be able to much easier be able to accept that change and to be able to look at things through a positive lens.
A child comes to you and says, so-and-so yelled at me and I'm really mad about it and it made me feel sad and whatever. So one, listen to it, don't discount it, don't discredit it, talk through those feelings, and then put this in perspective of life, because things are going to happen. How do you bounce back?
we teach all of our clients, what can we do in those times? How can you take your mind off of something? What's a hobby you could do? What is something you enjoy doing? Instead of maybe turning to something that's a little destructive or self-destructive, it's much better to, help people find healthy coping skills.
Think about that individual and actually care about where they are and actually care about what they see for themselves, and how they're defining their own success, and then support that.
Emotions can feel more manageable when kids put a name to their emotion. So some things that parents, caregivers, school teachers can do are help children know their emotions, name them, and be comfortable in them.
Everybody plays a role in building that resiliency. Friends, family members, educators, any trusted person in someone's life can help build resiliency.
We as humans are born to be resilient, and everyone has that capacity. And there are times that you may not feel like you are able to be resilient, and that's when you bring your community and your support system in. You do have those skills, you have it within you.
So I just want to, before we move on to the next pieces here, I just want to acknowledge some of the, I took some time to get caught up in the chat room, and I want to acknowledge that this is a topic that's absolutely resonating with so many folks. And I think it's important to just honor that. And there's beauty in the shared experience, and that was really part of the goal here, was to bring a group of people together and recognize that we're all from such different walks of life, but everyone's struggling with the same thing. And there was a couple comments there that really were around feelings of guilt that I may not have it as bad as others, so I'm suddenly not allowed to feel those things. And I want to squash that. I want to make sure that we also honor that grief and loss is not a competition. It's not about who may have it worse or who has it better. And that is, I think that is some folks' natural tendency, who are compassionate people, who are empathic people. Again, as you think about that pandemic parenting piece with the juggling, it's that way that we try to focus on meeting the needs of others without validating our own needs, without validating what it is that we're feeling. So I just wanted to comment on some of the things that I saw in the chat, and just thank people who are interacting with each other that way. So from here, I want to get really focused on, in the time that we have left together, focus on resiliency and what this means to raise resilient kids. And for some of you out there, this may be a refresher. For some, this may be some new concepts. But resilient kids have the ability to solve problems. They have the ability to know that there's no such thing as a quick fix. Resilient kids are able to take responsibility for decision making and practice thinking through options, thinking like other people might think. And again, what's that? That's empathy. Resilient kids have friends and have peer groups that support their resiliency. So it's important for caregivers to know who your kid's hanging around with. And I know that's so much easier said than done now. Resilient kids know what the rules of their house and what the rules of their family are. And more importantly, they know the consequence and what happens if those rules, that there's not arbitrary punishments or consequences happening. I've always suggested for the last 20 years now that rules and consequences for the family be well-defined, be posted, be visible, but also important, be developed with kids collaborating in that. Parents can help raise resilient kids by building self-esteem. Resilient kids know their strengths. Resilient kids can name the top 3 things that they're great at. Resilient kids have the ability to make healthy choices. They, whether they always do them or not, resilient kids know that scheduled meal times and getting enough sleep, going to bed and waking up in a consistent, the same time every day is important. It's important for families to make time for family, make time for togetherness. And I know that's asking even more for already burdened families and already burdened caregivers, especially when home is now work and play and family time, and those boundaries, as we've already talked about, are so blurred. But it's essential. It's essential to build new routines. It's essential to build new family traditions during this time. So pizza night out at Pat's Pizza every Friday night is obviously looking different, but that doesn't mean that pizza night has to end. It just means we have to do it in a different way. And again, routine. This is when we do meals, this is when we do homework, and this is when it's lights out. And just like I talked about with anxiety and ways that we encourage kids to manage their own anxiety, we talk to kids about building their resilience we talk to kids about how we improve their ability to rebound when times are tough. And so again, it's about sleep, and it's about practicing and experimenting with their sleep cycles. It's about paying attention to their diet and energy levels and exercising, and whatever that means for them, building this in as part of their routine. It's about kids having the ability to pat themselves on the back and recognize that it is okay to celebrate you when you've done something well, to not wait for other people to validate your successes. We should be the first person to acknowledge when we've done a good job. Deep breathing, even just 30 seconds a day of practicing mindfulness, getting feet on the ground and practicing with breathing is a way that kids can build resiliency. Finding their song lyrics or quotes from their favorite athletes or celebrities who they get strength from, who inspire them, and getting those quotes on school lockers or bathroom mirrors or headboards, or on that cereal bowl they go to grab in the morning, they see that note attached to that cereal bowl every morning. And then trying to see the positive. Resilient kids have the ability to find a silver lining. And that's not to say that we're Pollyanna, rose-colored glasses, or those kind of cliches, but it's again about empathy, that what's really hard for me right now may be really a success for somebody else. And so I think about, I didn't get the star role in the school play. That's a bummer. And I'm really sad about that. But somebody did. And so how do I feel that loss? How do I grieve that I didn't get the part in the play, but celebrate my friend who did? Resilient kids are able to do that. They spend time with other kids who make them feel good about themselves, who bring out the best in them. Kids who practice kindness and kids who participate in whatever spiritual activities that they enjoy, whatever is meaningful for them, tend to show more resilient skills. And so then how do we as a community, however you define community, how do we foster resiliency in our community? Well, we do things like mentor kids, offer opportunities for real life application. If I'm really good at car repair, maybe I try to buddy up with a kiddo who wants to learn those skills. Giving kids a voice in the decisions that impact them. I think about, again, generating house rules and consequences. But I also think about election years, and when there's major decisions that we as a community are making, how do I give kids a voice? Even though they can't go to the ballot box, how do I make them feel like they're included and that their voice matters? How do I make sure that youth feel listened to and heard, and that we are tackling decisions head on in full transparency and honesty? And then I, as a community member, need to make sure that I'm modeling safe and healthy choices in my own life, knowing that eyes are watching. Resilient adults are most often surrounded by resilient kids. And for those of you that are in education, that are listening in right now, how do you foster resiliency in your classroom? Well, you involve kids in decision making. You make sure kids feel welcome. You make sure you laugh together. You put together study buddy mentoring programs. You teach kids from a very early age how to name feelings and, just as important, how to ask for help when they need it. We encourage social action and community involvement, and here's some suggestions for doing that. We participate again in elections or debates on important topics. Our society right now is surrounded by important topics and national debates that we can encourage kids to share their thoughts and feelings about. And we can teach them how to do that, how to take action in those things that are important to them, but do it in a way that's pro-social, do it in a way that's kind. And we can finally encourage in our classrooms opportunities for physical outlets and structured downtime, and make our space a safe zone for everyone that's there to feel welcome. So this is a graphic that if anybody's ever traveled in a plane before, you've seen. And again, it's another cliche I'm introducing to you today, but I think it's also incredibly important when we talk about resiliency. And so for maybe the 3% of folks out there that have never seen this, regardless of what airline you fly, 100% of airlines have some graphic that looks like this. But conceptually, it until you start saying it out loud, it really doesn't make sense as fully as it can. So it's this idea that if your flight, if your plane is in trouble and the air masks drop, you've got to secure your mask first before you attempt to help other people. And for families and caregivers out there, you know that that goes against most of how you are wired as a parent and a caregiver. You're wired to want to reach out to your kids first and make sure kids are safe before you are. But what this simple graphic really drives home is that unless we are protected and cared for as adults, we are useless to those that are in our care. So just let that sink in for a bit. Until we have secured our own safety, and whether that's physical safety, like here on a plane, or I would argue emotional safety, until we've secured that safety, we are not of benefit to those that are in our care. And so as a family, how do we work together to build resiliency? Once I've secured that oxygen mask on myself, how can I work with my team, however I define that team for my family, whether it's those people that live in my house, those people that are living close by, or my extended family, wherever they be. Family resiliency is really tied to knowing that you're not alone. Families go through things together. And really, trainings like this emphasize that more and more. These are shared experiences that we are all going through together. And that together we are stronger, and we practice self-care together as a team. And we're going to create and post a family schedule and stick to it. And we're going to allow kids to participate in the development of that schedule. Going back to that pandemic parenting piece, we're going to try the best we can to define workspaces in our homes. What's my workspace? What's my family's play space? To the best of our ability, how do we create boundaries so that resentment and anger and stress and frustration don't build and get in the way of focusing on my family time and the time for togetherness? We're going to encourage each other. We're going to leave sticky notes for each other. We're going to leave inspiring quotes, but we're going to really embrace this idea that we are a team. We're going to laugh, and we're going to make mistakes, and we're going to learn from them. We're going to find silver linings wherever they can be, and we're going to model for kids that the ability to be empathic, to take the perspective of others, is an essential skill set. And then sort of these next pieces go together around building new family customs and new traditions. I love this idea of trying to be deliberate in changing your language. Instead of the cannots, instead of the no's, how do we get to yes? How do we get to yes, we can? And I think about what we all have experienced the last almost 3 months now of being surrounded by, you can't do this, you can't do that. This is no longer happening. Everywhere we've turned, there's been no's. There's been big X's through our everything around us. So how do we as a family get to yes? What would that look like to have ice cream for breakfast? What would that look like to have kids pick the movie night? What would that look like to dedicate a rainy Sunday to do nothing but lay on the couch together as a family and binge whatever favorite show you have as a family, to really honor this idea that we got to get to yes. And so staying strong during these challenging times, again, that oxygen mask has got to be on for you first. Again, accepting and validating feelings as normal, being gentle most often with ourselves, meditate in a way, whatever that means for you. And focus on your own self-care. Focus on sleep. Sleep is probably one of the most underrated elements of self-care I've seen. The ability to get just one more hour of sleep, to turn that alarm off one day a week, is essential for being strong right now. Embracing attitudes of gratitude, making time to laugh. Here's that laughter that keeps coming back in with this. Limiting news and limiting social media exposure. I've talked to so many people who have said, I haven't watched the nightly news now in 2 months. They just can't do it. And I applaud them for that. Saving Zoom, saving televideo for those meetings or those events that truly need video, building transition time for us, and recognizing that idea of Zoom fatigue, it's real. And so if I'm going to reserve some energy for whatever's around the next corner, I've got to take these little steps every day to make sure. And then the final thing I say here is recognizing that fear spreads faster than any virus ever could. And so as a family, as individuals, we want to focus on facts. We don't want to allow ourselves to get caught up in the what if scenarios that are happening all around us. That fear is more dangerous than any virus could be. And we've got to remember that even the little things like sunlight and pets and hobbies and activities and small goals and staying socially connected and not feeding into the loneliness, all of these little things are what's going to get us over that finish line, wherever that finish line is going to be. But that last 0.2 of this marathon, whenever it comes, is going to take every ounce of strength and every ounce of energy that we have left. And if you've ever spectated the end of a marathon, it's probably one of the most inspiring things you'll ever see. It hasn't inspired me to do it, but it's the most inspiring thing I've seen, where people are strangers are literally picking up the runners around them and helping carry them over the finish line. That strangers are using whatever energy they have left to support each other in this shared goal. And I think that's really where we're at right now as a state, as a community, as a nation. What will it take for us to grab onto each other and help us get through this marathon that we've all been forced to run together, whether we like it or not? And with that, I bring us to the end. And so I'm going to stay on, and I'm going to turn things back over to my colleagues on the planning committee and see what we have maybe for questions, if there are any.
Yeah, we do have a few questions. By far the most common so far is, will we have access to the PowerPoint afterwards? And yes, we will send the PowerPoint in a PDF format to anyone who attended to the registration address you registered with. Feel free to contact us at mainechildwelfareconference@gmail.com if you want it to go to another email address, and we'll make that available to you. The next question is, may we share the PowerPoint as part of a support training with our staff, or is it copyright protected?
It is not. Please feel free to share. I would just ask that you, as we all do, just credit sources and own what's ours and own what's not.
Another one is I'd love the piece about pandemic parenting to be available to share with the parents of my students. It might even be a great PSA on one of the news stations. I like to be able to share a link with my weekly newsletter. Is that something we could make available?
I know, hearing Mark at the beginning, that that this is being recorded and will be posted, so there will be a link to this presentation that I would welcome folks to use however they best can use it.
Mm-hmm. Another question is, are there any suggestions you have on helping us to be able to stay focused on our job while working from home?
I would go back to that, one of those final lists I shared about making sure that you are, to the best of your ability, carving out space, whatever that space looks like, that when you're in that chair, you're in work mode, but when you're out of that chair, you're in family mode, and setting boundaries and setting parameters for yourself and educating your housemates who you share that space with about what those parameters look like. The ability to stay focused on the task when I'm in this chair is, I think, is essential to that.
Another one, will the YouTube video be available to share with parents of our clients? Yes, we will make that available through various means, and we'll make sure to let you know via email and through our Facebook page how you can access this video and be able to share it with whomever you'd like. And that looks like all the questions we have through Zoom. If anyone is viewing through YouTube, please feel free to ask questions through the comments field there, and we'll feed them in here. Another question just came in. Any suggestions on helping us and the families that we support manage increased fatigue?
Yeah, structure, absolute structure, and engaging all members of that family. So as a family, agreeing on meal times, agreeing on what downtime looks like, and agreeing on what bedtime looks like, and recognizing again that sleep is the most undervalued resource that you have in your control. And so making sure that everyone in that house is getting the sleep that they need, and remembering what an 8-year-old needs for sleep, what a 14-year-old need for sleep, and what we as adults need for sleep may be a little different. So just boning up on, I think, those guidelines is helpful, and then educating families on why this is so important.
Any ideas on how to set those work parameters with a 10-year-old and a 4-year-old?
That sounds really challenging. You know, I know that 4-year-olds are some of the most appropriately neediest creatures on the planet. And so maybe it's more parameters with your understanding work family about what you can and cannot do right now. We're not going to bring a 4-year-old up to the level of understanding and perspective and empathy that your coworkers and hopefully your employer. So it may mean having a very honest conversation with the employers, with the adults in the room, on what you can do and what you can't do. And then it's engaging your natural supports to help you in any way you can. It's knowing where you need help and asking for it.
Another one, a question that came through the chat feed. With a child who was already lonely with no friends prior to lockdown, are there any suggestions?
Yeah, right now I think there's a wealth of resources that are popping up all the time on some virtual chat rooms and virtual support groups for kids, and trying to really be intentional of keeping kids connected. And so I would work with other families, with organizations like AFFM and GEAR, and Gear Parent Network, and try to find what other families are finding, so you don't have to recreate that wheel. And again, waste that time and energy trying to get resources that other people may have already identified. But depending on the age group of the kiddos, there are those resources out there. And I would say starting slow too. So maybe starting to find resources where there's online Lego groups or online comic book clubs or whatever the interest, whatever the kids' strengths are. How do you play into those strengths and reach out across this country to find support?
Okay. Here's one. Can you also talk about how the recent protests across the country might be complicating the pandemic stress and how to talk to kids about this?
Yeah. So I will reference the resource that Mark shared at the very beginning that's coming with PBS and our friends at Sesame Street. That I think that's going to be a superb resource for kids. And then I would just go back to the place in my presentation where we talked about grief and loss and anger. And this idea that as a society, we do anger really, really well. And I would argue that anger is a really great distraction during times of grief. That while there's functionality to the anger, if I think about that grief and loss model with Kubler-Ross, that it's much easier to go back to anger and stay there and hang out there than it is to continue to push forward and manage the depression that is inevitable. That's the appropriate response to grief. And so I would encourage us all and ourselves to pay attention to managing the grief, managing this pandemic, and compartmentalize that as much as possible from what's happening in our country from a race relations and a diversity and those other perspectives. So I think one does a great job in deterring us from the other, and we've just got to be aware of that and really be even more transparent in our words and our language, that we want to honor the experience of others as these race tensions continue. And we've absolutely got to continue along this grief loss process and mourn as it relates to the pandemic.
Got time for a couple more. When explaining to the families in our program that their child's mood swings during this time may be part of anxiety, does the advice for how to handle temper tantrums and meltdowns change?
That's a great question. So I've seen a lot of research and articles around how do families during this time, how do we maybe redefine what our expectations are and redefine what our thresholds are, and recognize that kids who are already struggling again are struggling even more. And so maybe the way that we managed saying no to kids, or maybe the way we managed consequences or responses to tantruming before March need to be reevaluated and need to be rethought through in this pandemic time. How do we maximize the support we're able to give to kids while recognizing that safety is non-negotiable? But how do we work with kids that maybe they can have a little bit more time to adjust to something disappointing that's come their way?
We've got a couple that are a little related here. What can we do to support families during the summer when school is not in session, when educators need a break as well? Mm-hmm. And semi-related, I work in an after-school program. How can we as the teacher be there for kids emotionally while having to practice social distancing? So both from the schools.
Yeah, so I think with the first piece, structure is just as important in the summertime. And I know that I can imagine a collective groan that just went out over hundreds of people. But when I say of structure, I mean, we don't want to take steps backwards from the routine and the structure that we've worked so hard on during the school year. And so kids, while the wake up time may be adjusted, it can't be stretched out so much because kids are now going to bed at 3 a.m. So they're getting up at noon or 1 o'clock. We've got to keep some semblance of consistency with sleep, with bedtime, with meal times. And we've got to help kids and families loosely plan their downtime. So it's appropriate to say to an adolescent in the middle of the summer, what are you going to do today? What's your plan for today? You know, what's on your list of I've got to get this done, and what's on your fun list? And some of that may be chores, some of that may be some schoolwork that's been left over, some of it may be treatment related. But adding those elements of those self-care tips for kids, adding those elements into the kids' day, I think would be a really good way of, again, modeling self-care and emphasizing the importance, but setting a parameter to ensure that it gets done.
Okay. We've got one that came in through YouTube. How do you help a family who has had a cancer death during COVID on 2/29?
Yeah, so that's been one of the complicating grief factors of this, is that individuals who have lost a loved one during this time have not been able to gather and to mourn, and thinking about those list of rituals that we went over. And, you know, I don't have a magic answer. I think that's part of what makes complicated grief so hard for us to manage, is that we're already grieving something, and then we've had another blow, and we're not we feel like we're not allowed to mourn and not allowed to process this. And so it's not the same, and any suggestion that I would give is going to feel like a cheap substitute, frankly, for the act of gathering and the act of a funeral, or the act of a celebration of life ceremony. And so I feel like that's such an individualized, I hope this isn't a cop-out answer, but I think that's such an individualized, personal and family decision, that here's the reality. We can't do this right now, but here's what we can do. And it may not have the same impact. It may not be as meaningful, but it's what we're able to do as a family right now.
Yeah. We do have more questions, and we will make sure that they get answered in a follow-up email. But we are running out of time here, and I want to make sure everyone has a chance to get to the evaluation and make sure you get your certificates of attendance. Let me share this screen real quick. So we would like to thank Chris McLaughlin for the time he spent preparing and presenting this webinar today. We'd also like to thank you, the attendees, for taking time out of your busy schedules, and hope this training was as helpful as we intended it to be. As we've said, the slides for this presentation will be sent to the email address you registered with, along with links to the full Acadia Cares video series. In addition, we have recorded this webinar and will post it on our Facebook page when it is available. So now would be a good time to follow us on Facebook. Head on over there. You can find us by searching for Maine Child Welfare Conference on Facebook. We do strongly encourage you to fill out a post-training evaluation form available at the link that's shown here. It's also been fed into the chat on both platforms. Once you've completed the evaluation, you'll be redirected to a page where you can access your certificate of attendance. For those using a PC or a Mac, you can right-click the certificate when you get to that screen to save it to your computer for printing. Those who are viewing through a mobile device, you can usually just touch and hold the certificate to save it to your device, or you can take a screenshot. We're going to leave this webinar running for a minute or so to make sure everyone has time to access the link. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at mainchildwelfareconference@gmail.com. And once again, thank you and have a great rest of your day.